This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. K-State Soil Fertility Specialist Dorivar Ruiz Diaz begins today's show as he discusses important soil fertility considerations for wheat production. In the first two segments, he chats about soil testing, nitrate levels, and liming. He says what growers should think through as the wheat season gets closer. Ending the show is K-State horticulture expert Matt McKernan, as he says there's still time to plant quick-maturing crops like radishes and leafy greens. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Thursday show discussing wheat production and soil fertility with K-State Soil Fertility Specialist Dorivar Ruiz Diaz. Dorivar, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Dorivar, when we're thinking about our soil for this next wheat season, what's your first recommendation from a soil fertility perspective?
Yes, of course, I think we need to be thinking about going back to the basics, make sure we have all we need there. We have the level of nutrients that are needed to have a successful crop, and all of that really start with soil testing. And so that's a place where I will start. There are some things that we need to keep in mind when it comes to soil sampling in particular, which is the first step. Make sure we get some good samples. And then after that is what are the main nutrients we need to be thinking about. And so that's the place where I will definitely start.
What makes a soil sample a good soil sample?
Yes, that's an excellent question. And there are a few things that are key aspects that we need to keep in mind when we are going out and collecting samples. One of those things is really making sure we have representative samples. We want to have enough subsamples. If we are collecting a sample that's going to go to the lab, we want to have at least 15 to 20 cores, ideally, that will go into that sample. We're mixing that well in a plastic clean bucket, and we're putting that in the bag that's going to the lab. But again, it is coming from multiple cores that we're collecting, so making sure we have enough subsamples to have representative sample of the area is very important. And this number of subsamples or cores that we are collecting is really regardless of the area that we're talking about. Even if we're doing grid sampling, we still want to have multiple cores that are going into that sample, because again, we are trying to deal with the small scale variability, and we want to have that sample that is going to be representative. So that's a key first step. The second point that is also important is to make sure we are consistent in terms of sampling depth. And here's one we may be talking about different sampling depth depending on what are the nutrients that we're looking at. Following K-State recommendations, if we're talking about the immobile nutrients, phosphorus, potassium, things like zinc, for example, we're really targeting 6-inch sampling depth. And it is important that we are consistent with that sampling depth as well, because as we know, nutrients are going to basically change in concentration as we go deeper in the soil, especially no-till systems. We may have higher concentration of phosphorus near the surface. And so again, that stratification that we have, if we're not being consistent with the sampling depth, obviously that number is going to be changing every time we're collecting a sample. So again, very consistent in that 6-inch sampling depth, which is what we use for K-State recommendations, is going to be a key for those immobile nutrients. Some other labs and maybe other states recommend different sampling depths, for example, 7 inches, 8 inches. And I think that's fine, as long as, again, we are following with that the right recommendations to making that fertilizer recommendation at the end of the day. Again, K-State fertilizer recommendations are all based on 6-inch for the immobile nutrients. Now, the second situation is when we're talking about mobile nutrients, which again, for our upcoming winter wheat crop, this is going to be very important. And we're talking here about things like nitrogen, sulfur, and chloride. These are nutrients that all three of them are very important for us for our wheat crop. We do have response to all these nutrients. And again, these are mobile nutrients, which would really require deeper samples, right? Because we want to capture what we have in that profile, not just in the upper 6 inches, but what we have in the profile. In some cases, depending on where you are in the state, we have situations where the heat this summer and conditions has been not ideal, and so we have some very low yielding in some cases, again, depending on where you are, which means we may have some residual nitrogen, for example, in some soils that we want to know about as we are planning our fertility program. In this case, mobile nutrients, we really like to have a sample, ideally up to 24 inches. This may not always be possible, and this is one question I often get is, what if I'm not able to get a 24-inch sample? I always say that it's still important to get whatever sampling depth that you can for those mobile nutrients. Sometimes that's maybe 12, 18 inches. That's okay. But it is much better than having just a 6-inch for a nitrate or sulfur or chloride sample. And so again, that's the other situation. So again, we really talk about two scenarios. Immobile nutrients, we're talking 6 inches for K-State recommendations. Mobile nutrients, we talk about 24 inches.
And how do nitrate levels play into all this when it comes to yields for the wheat crop?
Yes, that's really one of the key nutrients that we're talking about here, right? In that profile nitrogen, we can see cases where we have significant amount of nitrogen already, and of course, as we know, the main limiting nutrient for us in wheat is nitrogen, and I would say phosphorus. Probably those would be kind of the main ones. And in some cases, we may have enough residual that we may need just a small amount of nitrogen application to meet the requirements. And so again, that response is definitely there. It's very clear. We do have some data that shows residual nitrate correlation with yield response, and we can see that relationship is very strong. In other words, just relying on that residual nitrate already in the soil, in many cases can meet close to 100% of the needs of that wheat crop. Again, that changed a lot. That is the challenge, of course, in this case is that that may change from year to year, from conditions. Every year is going to be different. And the only way really to find out what we have there is really with that residual profile nitrogen test. Like I say, it is important if we are doing that sampling to go ahead and analyze for sulfur and chloride, which are two other essential nutrients. And if we're already doing the work of collecting that profile sample, of course, we wanna make sure we're also getting that information on other nutrients.
Is it a recommendation to test every year?
Excellent question. And here is where we're talking about mobile nutrients. Yes, right? Because again, these are mobile nutrients that can, for example, leach from the profile with the rainfall. We do have other factors affecting availability of those nutrients, like, for example, mineralization, the rate of mineralization we have that particular year, and so on. What happened to the previous crop, right? If we have, lower than expected yields, we may have residual amounts of these nutrients stay in the profile. And so it changed essentially from year to year, depending on what's happening. And so ahead of a wheat crop, yes, if we're talking about things like nitrate, sulfur, and chloride, we want to do that analysis ahead of every crop. Now, going back to the immobile nutrients, phosphorus, zinc, potassium, things like that, we typically will not recommend analysis every year. Those are immobile nutrients that we typically handle a little bit more for the rotation. We are looking at removal values. And typically the recommended is about every 3 to 4 years. I usually say, if we don't have any history of that particular field, sometimes it makes sense to do it maybe every 2 years, so we can develop a little bit more of a history of a field if you don't have that history. But if it is a field that you already been managed and you have, previous history of how those nutrients are changing over the years, that's also another key value, right? We're talking about phosphorus, for example. We don't as you develop the history in the field becomes even more useful information, right? Because we're not just looking at, sampling on 1 year. We're looking at how, your fertility program, removal, and so on is affecting your overall levels over, say, the last 5, 10, or 15 years. And so, but yes, in the case of immobile nutrients, we don't need to do analysis or sampling ahead of every crop.
And while we are thinking about our wheat crop, what about acidic soils?
That's an excellent question, and this is one thing that for us is something that we need to keep an eye on. We have some parts of the state, especially, for example, South Central region, where we tend to have more acidic soils. So managing pH becomes really important for the wheat crop, but also for the entire rotation. We have other crops, obviously, legumes like soybean are going to be a lot more sensitive to acidic soils than we have corn. And so if we have a rotation, pretty much all the crops will be affected by low pH issues. And so this is important, obviously, for the wheat crop, but like I say, it's really something we need to be thinking about for the entire rotation. So if we're taking care of this low pH situation ahead of the wheat crop, it's going to be benefiting not just the wheat crop, but also what's coming next. And so again, it is something we need to put in that perspective.
That was K-State Soil Fertility Specialist Dorivar Ruiz Diaz. We are cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but when we come back, we'll once again be joined by Dorivar as we conclude our soil fertility and wheat production conversation. If you are reaching your destination and aren't going to be able to hear the rest of today's show, but would like to take a listen, you can find it by going to agtoday.net or by searching for Agriculture Today on your favorite podcast platform. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we continue our show with our continued conversation with K-State Soil Fertility Specialist Dorivar Ruiz Diaz as we continue talking about soil fertility and wheat production. Dorivar, as we were thinking about those acidic soils, not only do we need to think about the soils, but what else do we need to think about when it comes to making these changes?
Thinking about the economics of liming as well. The economics of liming is really multi-year, right? We are getting multiple crops that are benefiting from this, where we see that yield benefit. We also need to be thinking about other aspects of fixing a pH issue. For example, availability of phosphorus and availability of other nutrients. And so, again, increasing the efficiency of nutrients that we're putting is going to be another factor that we need to consider. Specifically for the wheat crop, one thing that we often see, especially when it's drier conditions in the fall, combined with acidic soils, aluminum toxicity is really the main issue. And if we're thinking about low pH, the main problem is really aluminum toxicity. As pH goes, say, 5.5 or below or lower than that, then aluminum basically gets in solution. And aluminum is a toxic element really to the roots. And so we start to see problems of aluminum toxicity. Oftentimes that's the symptoms that we get to see. Seems like the wheat crop looks like affected by drought condition, shows some nutrient deficiency symptoms. And all of this is because the aluminum toxicity is basically limiting the root development. So anything like water uptake and nutrient uptake are being affected. So again, that's really the main issue in that case. One thing that I wanted just to go back, maybe the first point about sampling, soil sampling depth in particular. Here is one situation where we're talking about lime application and pH in no-till systems. We need to be thinking about potentially different sampling depth. And the reason for this is because if we are applying lime on the surface in a no-till system and we are not incorporating that with a tillage operation, then the lime is only moving about 3 inches. And so we are not really liming the entire 6-inch profile. We only liming in a way, we only liming the upper 3 inches. So one alternative, of course, is that we are collecting a 6-inch sampling depth and pH comes back low. We are thinking about a lime application. Then essentially one option is just to apply half the rate of that recommendation. I really will encourage people to do a second sampling looking at only the upper 3 inches, because that will give us a better number for that pH issue. Of course, we don't need to be doing 3-inch sampling all the time. This is something that only will be needed if we are deciding to do lime application. Again, it is a big investment. We want to make sure we put in the right rate. And so having a better idea in no-till system for surface application, we definitely need that 3-inch sampling there for lime application. One issue with this is also that we want to make sure we put the right rate, enough lime, but also we want to be careful not to put too much. If we put too much lime, we get to the other extreme where we can have maybe increasing pH higher than optimum, where we have some tie-up of nutrients. And so it is something we need to keep in mind. Another key factor also with pH and liming in particular is that if we are thinking about lime application, I will also strongly encourage people to consider doing grid sampling, because pH can vary significantly across the field. And so variable rate application is the best way to do lime application, because again, things that I mentioned earlier, we want to make sure and put the right amount. We want to make sure we're not putting too much. And again, if we're thinking about uniform applications across the field, we always have the risk of maybe putting too much in some parts of the field, not putting enough in others. And so again, that combination of grid sampling and variable rate is really the best way to do lime application.
So Dorivar, when you're thinking about for the wheat growers getting their fields ready for this next planting season, what are your top recommendations?
Yes, top recommendations are focusing, of course, where we may be seeing the most return to investment when it comes to fertility management. And main limiting factors are typically going to be nitrogen and phosphorus. And so those will be the place where I would start, and then go from there. Make sure we're taking care of those. Of course, we talk about pH. That would be the third factor as well. Depending on where you are in the state, that may be something we need to watch very closely. In the case of nitrogen, again, there may be situations where we have significant amounts in the soil. We want to make sure we know that, so we're saving that nitrogen fertilizer dollars there. In the case of phosphorus, one thing that I often see is that it's when budgets are tight, it's pretty easy to cut on phosphorus rates because we don't maybe see it necessarily like we do see it for nitrogen. In nitrogen, we often see that yellowing. You really see when you have nitrogen deficiency. Oftentimes, that's not very clear in the case of phosphorus. But it is one nutrient, especially in winter wheat, that we can see significant response to phosphorus. And so again, that will be another key nutrient where we will tend to see that return to investment most of the time, especially in that when soil test values are showing low and that the need for phosphorus application. We need to be thinking about also placement of those nutrients, be as efficient as possible. In the case of nitrogen, if we decide to do applications, how can we do that application in the most efficient way, minimizing losses? Same thing for phosphorus also. Applying with the seed, ban apply, phosphorus is always going to be a lot more efficient. And the wheat crop always see a very, very strong response to that type of application. Phosphorus have a significant role in terms of fall establishment, root development, tillering, which again, that establishment in the fall is going to really benefit and again, translate that into yields next spring.
Is fall the only time for soil testing to take place when it comes to the wheat crop?
That's an excellent question, Shelby. And I will say I see some cases where producers maybe were not able to collect samples in the fall for many reasons, and they may want to go back and do that later in the winter or early spring, and that's definitely a possibility. We just need to keep in mind a few things. One of them is that if we are already going and applying some fertilizer ahead of planting or at planting time, that's going to affect our soil test. And so we want to be very careful if we do that. In many cases, I tell producers that there may be very little value in that soil analysis because, again, we sort of contaminating already that soil sample if we did some applications at planting. In many cases, we are not doing that. In many cases, we just maybe have a small window for planting. We went ahead and do the planting, and we're coming back later maybe with the sampling and fertilizer. application. In that case, it's absolutely fine to go ahead and do that analysis and make that decision maybe for top dressing, especially for nitrogen. Later this fall, if we're not doing any fertilizer application, collect the sample, see what we have there, and make that decision for top dressing later in the spring. And so, yes, that's absolutely it's absolutely an option still.
Dorivar, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you.
That was Kansas State University soil fertility specialist Dorivar Ruiz Diaz. We did also have a conversation in the first segment with Dorivar discussing wheat production and soil fertility. If you missed it or want to go back and listen to it, you can find it by going to agtoday.net, or you can also search for Agriculture Today on your favorite podcast platform. If you are wanting to read more on this topic, there are 3 Agronomy e-update articles. I, of course, will link them in today's show notes on agtoday.net, or you can also find them for yourself by going to agronomy.k-state.edu/e-updates. Once again, that's agronomy.k-state.edu/e-updates. There are 3 articles, and their titles are as follows. The first one is Planning Your Wheat Fertility Program. Start now with soil testing. The second one is Soil Fertility and Wheat Production. Profile nitrate levels and wheat yield. The third one is Soil Fertility and Wheat Production. Liming soils for optimum performance. Once again, these will be linked in today's show notes on agtoday.net. Before we do cut to a break, I would also like to let you know about the upcoming Flinchball Forum, which will be taking place September 3rd, which is a Thursday, starting at 11 a.m., through September 4th, which is a Friday, at noon. The Flinchball Forum will be being held at the K-State Alumni Center in Manhattan, Kansas. Standard registration is $250 per person and includes access to all Flinchball Forum attendee programming and the evening reception. There also is the option of a reserved table of 8 for $1,600. Registration for the 2026 Flinchball Forum does end Monday, August 31st at 5 p.m. Once again, registration does end Monday, August 31st at 5 p.m. You can find more information about the Flinchball Forum by going to flinchballcenter.com. Once again, that is flinchballcenter.com. I will also link this resource in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but when we come back, we'll be joined by K-State's Matt McKernan with this week's horticultural segment.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. Planting a fall vegetable garden in Kansas takes advantage of warm soils in late summer, transitioning into cooling autumn air. And there's still time to plant quick maturing crops. K-State Extension horticulture expert Matt McKernan says this includes radishes and leafy greens. Matt, not officially fall yet, but we are talking about fall vegetable gardens, and really this is a good time to do some planting.
It is. A lot of people are tired from the summer heat and aren't thinking about planting our fall crops, but planting some of our vegetable crops now can actually create really larger produce and maybe better flavored produce even than if we planted it in the spring. So with fall gardening, it's really important that we're prepared this time of year to take action when the right time comes around so that we can get those crops started and growing as we move into the fall months.
Talk a little bit about the timing of the planting, though. Why is this so critical?
Timing is really important because we want to make sure that we get our crops harvested before our frosts and freeze set in for the winter. Typically around Kansas, it's going to vary depending on where you live in the state, what your first freeze is, but for most of Kansas, we say an average of mid-October is kind of that first time for our first freeze or frost of the year. And so with that, we kind of have to work backwards to make sure that we have enough days for the plants to grow and produce bountiful harvests for us to collect before that freeze and frost sets in. So when we're looking at our seed labels or determining what to plant in the fall, we really want to be paying attention to the part of the seed label that talks about days to maturity or days to harvest. That's basically going to give you an X number of days that it takes this variety of plant to grow before it is able to be harvested. And even among one type of vegetable, for example, the varieties can vary very wildly on the number of days it takes to produce a mature crop. And so it's really important to pick varieties that are going to be fast maturing in the fall and have a shortened days to harvest time period so that we can harvest them before that cold weather sets in.
I imagine that a lot of gardeners probably know the vegetables they want to plant in the fall, but maybe what are some things that do mature quickly?
Yeah, so the things that we're really looking to plant this time of year is a lot of our cool season vegetables, like our cole crops, the broccolis, cauliflowers, things like that, and a lot of our leafy greens, kind of our salad greens. Those are going to be the two types of crops that are really going to be most productive this time of year. A lot of our vegetable crops in the gardens, like our tomatoes, our okras, our peppers, they'll continue to produce for several more months, so we'll have those to mix in, but a lot of our salads and things like that are really the plants that we want to be planting right now in order to harvest this fall.
And this is probably good for people who've been doing a lot of canning because these are things that don't necessarily have to be canned or probably shouldn't be canned.
Exactly. The shelf life on a lot of these cool season leafy greens is not going to be super long, and so it's a really great way to add some fresh produce in our diets as we start to move into winter.
What are some best management practices or maybe some tips that people should keep in mind?
Yeah, so if we're going to plant a lot of our leafy greens, most of those are going to be best planted in late August to early September. So things like lettuce, spinach, kale, bok choy, even some of our more exotic leafy greens like arugula, all are really going to be best planted in that late August to early September time frame. If we want some of our cole crops, things like broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, most of those are going to be planted a little bit earlier in the month, actually, kind of late July to early August. And most of those we're actually planting as transplants that time of year rather than seed. So if you want to try some of those transplants still yet this month, I think there's still time to plant. You just want to try to get as large of a transplant from a garden center or nursery as possible so that you have a couple weeks head start, basically, with how much time that plant's already growing.
Is the fall garden typically smaller than what we might do at other times of the year?
There are a few more limitations on the plants that we can plant in the fall garden. A lot of things like Irish potatoes or peas really don't do as well because of the summer heat, but a lot of our leafy greens will. It's also going to help our cool season crops if we plant the seeds a little deeper in the soil so that we get them into a little bit cooler of a soil. We probably need to water a little bit more frequently to keep those seeds wet and moist so they germinate well. And we can also use season extension techniques like row covers or things like that to help really prolong our growing season even into the early winter months.
That's really kind of taken hold, hasn't it? People really extending the length of the garden season.
Yes, it's very easy to do, and once you have that initial investment in your row cover or whatever you're going to use, it's something that you can use year after year to really extend that gardening season.
That's K-State Extension horticulture expert Matt McKernan with information on planting a fall garden. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.